I see that Ted is smiling. He is happy. So I'm assuming that people did tell him, thank you, Ted, for starting us off on that series on the storm. So I believe it's been good. Now, I had one person come to me and said, Pastor, I noticed that when you were talking about hoarding, you kept looking at me. So I do apologize. I didn't mean anything personal, but I was just sweeping, as we say, the glance, but maybe it just locked onto you for a fleeting moment longer than it should have, but nothing personal here. So I'm not trying to persuade you to either be a hoarder, nor am I persuading you to be a minimalist. But it's just one of those things in the text that reminds us that when we go through the journeys and storms of life, there are things we must toss overboard because they can slow us down. So if you listen to the reading that Noah read for us today, you will see in verse 18. I wonder if we have it up. It's not, it's come here. Okay, very good. In verse 18, we read that we took such a violent battering. They're still in the storm. They haven't come out of it. They've done everything possible. They've done the undergirding. They've done what they call frapping, making the boat very firm, the ship very firm. But now in verse 18, we took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. That's verse 18. And then we come to verse 19. On the third day, 3 days after that, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. And so you will see they're throwing the cargo overboard and then the tackle. All this to make sure that they're not carrying excess weight. They want to get through the storm. They want to get through this difficult phase. They want to reach shore safely. And for that reason, they are throwing overboard all their excess weight. Now, scholars tell us that this ship that Paul and his companions who were traveling, that this ship was actually a grain ship. You know, this is possibly traveling from Alexandria in Egypt all the way to Rome. And as we know, when Paul was writing this, Rome was the center of the then known world. So all roads led to Rome, and all roads led out from Rome. And so here was one of these ships. Many of the ships plied this route. Basically, they would start from Egypt. Egypt was basically one of the big suppliers to Rome, the Roman Empire. And so this was doing the route. They would stop in different places and eventually get to Rome. So Paul's on one of these ships. So their cargo possibly means the grain that they were carrying. And then we come to verse 19. What do we read? That on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle. Now, I know the word tackle means different things to us depending on the context of usage. But tackle here means the riggings and the ropes and the blocks and all the equipment at that time that would enable the ship to load and unload the cargo. So maybe there was some very basic and fundamental crane kind of things, maybe certain gadgets that enabled them to load and unload cargo. So 3 days later, they realized, this is life and death. We may not make it. So let's throw the tackle. Let's throw all the fundamentals, the essentials that make us function as a grain ship. Let's toss these overboard. Now, what's the spiritual insight for us today? I've always been maintaining that even though this is a real storm that the Apostle Paul and the team went through, there are important spiritual insights for us in our walk of faith. The insight is that as we journey through the storm, the Lord may be reminding us to toss a few things overboard that are not essential for that part of the journey. Because storms, even though they are painful, storms bring us down to the core element of our walk of faith. They bring us down to the fundamentals. They help us strip us of all those excesses and bring us down to just me and Jesus. You remember Corrie ten Boom's famous statement or saying, which I mentioned last Sunday. She said, you can never say that Jesus is everything to you unless and until you've been in a situation where he's all you've got. And a storm does just that. It brings you to a point where it's just you and Jesus. Nobody else to support you, nobody else to stand with you, nobody else who understands you. It's just you and Jesus. And that's the time you discover that Jesus is everything to you. We've all been through storms like that. Some of us may be going through a storm. Some of us will go through a storm. And then we need to remember that Jesus with us is all we need to have. And a storm brings us to that point where we discover this, and then out of that discovery, we rise up to a new life, a transformative life and an experience that is filled with contentment, filled with joy, and filled with hope. Hope and joy and contentment do not come from material things or experiences. They come from this deep sense of meaning that Christ gives us when we recognize that it was just Him and us as we were going through the storm. Now, in this episode, we see in verse 18 and 19, they are tossing things overboard. And even in our walk of faith, as we go through the storms, the Lord will take us to a point, and through the work of God's Spirit, He may remind us that we need to toss certain things overboard. We need to leave certain things behind. And I want to suggest a few things for your prayerful consideration, not making you feel guilty, but something to think about as you continue on your walk of faith. The first one that I'd like you to think about is memory. Now, we all have good memories. Don't I know that from my association with you? You remember things extremely well. And this is true of human nature. We have very good memories. But the problem with our good memories is that sometimes we remember what we shouldn't remember, and we remember it the wrong way. I've quoted Miroslav Volf, who was actually a survivor from all the East European tragedies and killings and murders and all of that. He said the problem with memory is not what we remember. It is how we remember. And he said how we remember is a matter of choice. And if you think about it, we carry memories of all kinds of things that have happened to us. You cannot erase that, but you and I can make a choice as to how we remember. So the first thing that I want to suggest that we consider is memories. And I want to take you to a story in the Old Testament. Don't worry, it's not a long story. It's not a whole chapter. As Sarah will tell you, it is just one verse. Yes, we'll come to Hebrews in a bit. Deuteronomy 3:26. Thank you, Sarah. That's the verse we're looking for. This is Moses talking to the people of Israel. Now, you know a whole lot about Moses. Moses was a powerful man of God. Moses was the man whom God used to perform those miracles, signs, and wonders. Moses was the person who talked with God very intimately. But Moses was nursing a grudge. He was nursing a hurt feeling against God. Because as you know, Moses saw the promised land from a distance, but God did not allow him to enter the promised land. Why? Because God said there was an incident. You know the incident is good, Fairview Church of God people, where he was supposed to do something with the rock to bring forth water, but the people incited him to anger. He was so angry with the people, and he acted in anger. And God said, because you dishonored me before the people, you will not enter the promised land. And so this is something that disappointed Moses. He was nursing this hurt feeling. And so time and time again, when he came to God, he would say, God, you know, I've always told you I want to go into the promised land, but you didn't allow me to go through that. I am hurt, God, about this. And so this probably has happened a few times. He remembered that incident, even though it was now a few years later. He chose to nurse that hurt and that bad feeling, that bitterness that he had, that he would not be able to enter the promised land. So each time he comes to God, maybe he said, God, you know, I'm still hurt about the fact that you didn't allow me to enter the promised land. And then God says here in Deuteronomy 3:26, he's telling this to the people, but because of you will see Moses is still blaming the people. He said, because of you people, you incited me. Look what has happened to me. The Lord was angry with me and would not listen to me. This is what the Lord says. That is enough, the Lord said. Do not speak to me anymore about this matter. And I believe God might be encouraging and inviting some of us to consider that statement. God might be saying, each time you come to me for prayer, you are remembering something that happened 5 years ago. You are remembering and holding on to something that happened 10 years ago, and you are hashing and rehashing it all the time. And God may be inviting you to consider this line where he says, do not speak to me anymore about this matter. And why is that? Because God says, I've dealt with it. I've forgiven you. I've forgiven the people who did this to you. It has happened. It is unfortunate. But now God says it is time to move on. So each time God wants to move us forward, what do? Like good old Moses, we go back and say, God, remember 5 years ago, so and so did this, and I'm very hurt and I'm very disappointed. And God says, can we not talk about this again? Because I assured you of my forgiveness. I assured you that all is well. And now I want you to move forward. And I wonder, as we talk about tossing things overboard, whether memory or remembering things wrongly is one of those things that God is talking to us about today. There might be certain things God might be saying, that's done. We've dealt with it. It's in the past. Now don't bring that up again. I want you to move forward and walk with me. The second thing that I want to consider tossing overboard in our walk of faith, one is memory. The second, that it might be some object or some practice. There are things that we might be holding on to that may have outlived their usefulness. And I want to tell you a story about one word. The word is called Nehushtan. Have you heard of Nehushtan? You haven't. Even I didn't until not too long ago. Yes, Sarah has brought the verse up. The word Nehushtan means a bronze thing or a bronze serpent. And Nehushtan is a very interesting concept, and it is true and applicable in our lives as well. In 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 4, we read about this king who removed all the high places. He did great things, the Asherah poles, all that he removed. He was a righteous king. He broke into pieces the bronze snake Moses had made, for up to that time, this is quite a number of years, the Israelites had been burning incense to it. It was called what? Nehushtan. So when you go home today and people ask you, what was the sermon about? You want to confuse your family members, you can say it was about Nehushtan. And they'll ask you, what church do you go to? Couldn't they find a better topic to preach on? But Nehushtan was a bronze serpent. You know the story in Numbers 21. The Lord told Moses, I want you to make the bronze serpent. Why? There were lots of serpents, and it was God's plan that they construct or build or form this bronze serpent and hold it on a stick. At that time, God said, I want you to do this. He told Moses. It was God's will. It was God's ordained focus of faith. And God told Moses, tell the people to gaze on the serpent and they will be healed. But now, some of these people had held on to that bronze serpent and they started worshiping it. And quite a number of years later, they are still worshiping it. And that is why it is called Nehushtan. Nehushtan. In our lives, we all have our own versions of Nehushtan. It might be an object. It might be a practice that we used in ministry, even in our walk of faith. There was a time when God told you to get into it. There was a time when God directed you to that. But now we have moved on. Times have changed. And that object, that practice has outlived its usefulness. But you're still holding on to it, and you don't want to let go. So that is Nehushtan. So God may be inviting us to toss some of our own Nehushtans overboard as we get through the storms of life. Thirdly, we want to look at habits. There might be some habits. There's no Bible verse for that, but we'll come back to Hebrews 12:1 in a moment. But there might be habits. Certain habits, certain unproductive, time-consuming habits that we might be engaged in that might not be enabling us to live up to God's full potential. It might be something that we are engaged in. It's not evil, mind you. That's really the concern here. These weights that we are encouraged to toss overboard, these are not necessarily sin. These are good things. These might even be legal things that we're doing, but they are slowing us down in the walk of faith. It could be any habit that is unproductive, that is taking a lot of our time, and it is not enabling us to walk in the fullness of God's hope. It could also be conversations. Sometimes we engage in conversations that are not productive at all, and we spend quite some time engaging in these unproductive conversations. And at the end, it drives your spirit down. It discourages you. It brings you down. And you ask yourself, why did I even engage in that unproductive conversation? Because it saps the energy out of your spirit. So God may be prompting, God may be speaking to you today through His word to encourage you to consider some of those conversations you have. And my last thing before I get into Hebrews 12 in a moment is God may be saying, toss overboard the journey of life or the ship of life, some of those fights you've been having. Now, I'm not saying that we are a fighting congregation. I see Petra getting a little concerned. We are not a fighting congregation, Petra. I didn't mean like that. But if you take our life, you see that sometimes we love a good fight. And God may be saying, toss those fights overboard. And as we talk about fights, I want to quote from a book that I read some time ago, but it is from the work of Dana Akuri. It's called Sacred Wandering, Growing Your Faith in the Dark. And it's very appropriate because when you're going through a storm, you feel like you're trying to grow your faith in the dark. There's no direction, there's no compass, there is no sense of where you're headed, and you're trying to grow your faith. And here's what Dana Akuri says. I started succeeding when I started leaving small fights for small fighters. I stopped fighting those who gossiped about me. I stopped fighting for attention. I stopped fighting to meet people's expectations of me. I stopped fighting for my rights with inconsiderate people. I stopped fighting to please everyone. I stopped fighting to prove they were wrong about me. I left such fights for those who have nothing else to fight for. And instead, I started fighting for my vision, my dreams, and my destiny. And so that's something to think about, because here's a little poem to encourage us to pick our fights, as we'd like to say. Not to expend our energies in running all over. And God may be encouraging us, leave some of those fights, toss those fights overboard, and continue on the journey of faith. So we've looked at a few areas that God may be encouraging us to throw overboard, these weights that might be slowing us down. Talking of weights, you will see in Acts chapter 27, they threw the cargo overboard. They threw the tackle, the ship's tackle overboard because it was weighing them down. It was not evil. It was not setting a fire. It was not causing the ship to catch fire. It was just weighing the ship down. And I close by taking you to Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1. You like the word close? It's like water to a famished soul. You know the end is in sight. Hebrews chapter 12. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. So this is a verse that I'm sure Pastor Roger has preached on numerous occasions during his time, and I've preached on it once. And we see here that the journey of faith is like a race. Now, I know there's reference to sin, and sin we all know is evil. That word for sin is used over 150 times in the New Testament. But I draw your attention to another word. What's that word? The weight that hinders. Let us throw off everything that hinders. And that word for let us throw off everything that hinders is used only once and only in this place in the New Testament. It's not a sin. It's any weight. It's some protuberance, anything that basically slows you down. And we see from the story of the storm how these men decided to throw certain essentials even overboard so that they could get to their destination. And so may God help us as we consider what some of those things might be, what some of those excesses, areas that we are holding in our blind spots. May God's Holy Spirit lead us, encourage us to toss some of those things overboard so that we can keep moving forward towards the goal and the destiny that God has for us. I now invite the worship team to come and lead us in the song of affirmation, Same God. That's the God who leads us through the storm, and He will bring us out victoriously.